Senator Kennedy asked the FBI director if someone murdered Jeffrey Epstein. He had 6 words. The question was not for the Attorney General this time. It was for the man who runs the FBI, the man whose agency conducted the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's death, the man who, as FBI director, is institutionally responsible for the federal investigation that produced the official determination that sits at the center of every question this hearing was built around. Senator John Kennedy looked at Kash Patel across the witness table and asked the question that the documented record of that investigation makes impossible to avoid. Did Jeffrey Epstein hang himself, or did somebody kill him? Patel's position in that room was different from an attorney general's. An attorney general can speak to institutional policy, to prosecutorial decisions, to the department's position on disclosure and redaction, and the applicable legal standards. An FBI director speaks to the investigation itself, to what was found, to what was examined, to what the agents did and did not do, what the forensic teams concluded, what the evidence showed. When Kennedy asked Patel that question, he was not asking for a departmental position. He was asking the head of the investigative agency that produced the official finding. Patel's posture at the witness table had been the composed posture of someone who had prepared for a difficult hearing and was managing it with visible discipline. He had been answering questions with the controlled precision of a federal law enforcement official who understands that everything said in that room is on the record. He had been meeting Kennedy's eyes. He had not been reaching for his materials unless he needed to reference something specific. When the 6 words arrived, something shifted in the quality of his stillness, not a visible physical reaction. The subtler change that happens when a person has been waiting for a question and it finally comes exactly as expected. The particular alertness of someone retrieving a prepared answer. His hands, which had been flat on the table, came together briefly. He looked at Kennedy. He said he believed Epstein hung himself in a cell in the Metropolitan Detention Center. Kennedy wrote something down. He did not move on. This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. Let's start with the documented facts of what the FBI's investigation produced. Jeffrey Epstein died on August 10, 2019 at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, not the Metropolitan Detention Center, a distinction that matters because Patel, as FBI director, is the person in that hearing room most expected to have the precise institutional details of one of the most scrutinized federal custody deaths in modern American history. He was awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. He had been placed on suicide watch following a prior incident and then removed from it. On the night of his death, the security cameras covering the area outside his cell were not functioning. The 2 guards assigned to check on him every 30 minutes were asleep. They had falsified the logs. A fact that was later confirmed when the guards admitted to falling asleep and entering false check records to indicate they had performed the required rounds. The medical examiner's initial report listed the cause of death as pending. The final determination was suicide by hanging. Dr. Michael Baden, a forensic pathologist hired by Epstein's brother to independently examine the body, reached a different conclusion. Baden said the injuries to Epstein's neck were more consistent with homicide by strangulation than with suicide by hanging. He cited specific bone fractures, including fractures of the hyoid bone and thyroid cartilage, that he said occur more frequently in homicidal strangulations than in suicidal hangings. The FBI's position remains suicide. The case has not been reopened. The cameras weren't recording. The guards were asleep. The logs were falsified. And the official determination is suicide. Every one of those facts is in the FBI's investigative record. Patel is responsible for that record. Kennedy's technique in that hearing room has been consistent across every hearing where he has used it. The architecture is always the same, and it is always recognizable to people who have watched it operate. It follows a specific architecture that explains why the exchanges he produces are different from most congressional questioning. He does not build toward questions. He arrives at them. Each question is framed as a binary, a yes or no that forces the witness into a specific position before the follow-up question narrows it further. He establishes a fact, confirms it, establishes another fact, confirms it, and then asks the question that the accumulation of confirmed facts makes impossible to answer with a comfortable non-answer. When a question is general, a witness can respond to the general. When a question invites context, a witness can provide their preferred context. Kennedy does not give general or contextual questions. He gives specific, factual binary ones, and he gives them in sequence so that each confirmation builds the foundation for the next question, and the final question has nowhere to go except the answer. Kennedy pressed on the cameras, not as a technical question about facility management. The Metropolitan Correctional Center is operated by the Bureau of Prisons, not the FBI, but as an investigative question. The FBI conducted the death investigation. The cameras covering the area outside Epstein's cell were not functioning at the time of his death. The FBI's investigation had access to that fact. Kennedy wanted to know what the investigation concluded about the cameras, whether their failure was documented as a malfunction, whether it was investigated as a potential act of sabotage, whether the investigative record contains a documented determination about why the cameras were not operational on that specific night. Patel said they were working through the release of the relevant documentation. Kennedy asked when the full information would be released. There was a pause, not the pause of a witness processing a difficult question, the pause of someone running a specific calculation. What commitment can I make in this room, on this record, with cameras running? That is consistent with the position the FBI has maintained since the investigation concluded, and that does not create an obligation I am not prepared to honor. Patel's hands moved slightly on the table. He looked at his prepared materials. Then he looked back at Kennedy. He said in the near future. Near future is a phrase that has a specific institutional history in this investigation. Every attorney general, every FBI director, every DOJ official who has been asked about the Epstein disclosure timeline has reached for some version of it. Forthcoming, working through it, soon, near future. The phrase functions as a commitment without a commitment. It acknowledges that the documentation exists and will eventually be released while providing no mechanism by which the release can be compelled or the timeline evaluated. It transforms an accountability question into a process question, and process questions have no deadline. Kennedy has been receiving near future answers since 2019. Patel had no timeline. He had the phrase near future. He used it. Kennedy said, like before I die. That question landed in the room the way Kennedy's questions do, with the specific weight of someone who has been listening to the same answer for years and has decided to name what the answer is. Kennedy is 73 years old. He has been in the Senate since 2017. He has been asking about Jeffrey Epstein's death since the night it happened. He has watched every commitment to forthcoming disclosure produce documents that raised more questions than they answered, or produce no documents at all. He asked the question with the specific weariness of someone who has mapped the distance between near future and actual future and knows exactly how long that distance has been growing. Patel said they were working through it in a way that protects victims and doesn't put irrelevant information into public circulation. Kennedy wrote something down. Now let's talk about what the FBI's custodianship of this investigation actually means and why Patel's position in that hearing room is different from an attorney general's. The Metropolitan Correctional Center was operated by the Bureau of Prisons, not the FBI. The guards who fell asleep were Bureau of Prisons employees. The security camera system that wasn't functioning was a Bureau of Prisons facility system. The administrative failures, the removal from suicide watch, the falsified logs, the non-functioning cameras, are failures in Bureau of Prisons operations. Patel is not the director of the Bureau of Prisons. He cannot be held institutionally responsible for the operational decisions of a facility his agency does not manage. What the FBI is responsible for is the investigation of the death. That responsibility is not limited to processing the Bureau of Prisons' administrative failures and incorporating them into an institutional narrative. The FBI's investigative responsibility is to determine whether the confluence of those failures, the camera malfunction, the guard behavior, the log falsification, the sequence of a removal from suicide watch followed by death, represents what it appears to represent on its surface or something else. The FBI investigates deaths. It has forensic expertise. It has the authority to obtain records and compel testimony and analyze evidence. What its investigation of Epstein's death produced, the official conclusion of suicide, is a conclusion that sits alongside documented anomalies without fully accounting for them. And that distinction is the one that makes Kennedy's questions in that hearing room more pointed than they might appear. The Bureau of Prisons failed. That failure has been documented, reported, and resulted in disciplinary action. But the FBI's responsibility is different. It is to investigate what those failures mean, whether the failures were negligence or something else, whether the camera malfunction was equipment breakdown or something else, whether the simultaneous sleep of both guards was exhaustion or something else, whether the physical evidence, the bone fractures that Baden's examination identified as more consistent with homicide than suicide, was examined with the rigor and independence that a death of this significance requires. The FBI's investigation produced a conclusion: suicide. That conclusion is documented. It is the official federal determination. Kennedy was asking Patel to account for that conclusion in the face of the documented anomalies that coexist with it. Patel said he believed Epstein hung himself. Believed, not. The investigation found. Believed. The word believed is doing significant work in that sentence. Not. The FBI's investigation determined that Epstein died by suicide, and here is the complete evidentiary basis for that determination. Believed. It is the word of a person offering a personal assessment rather than an institutional conclusion based on a complete review of the evidence. An FBI director asked about a concluded federal investigation should be able to say, "The investigation found," not, "I believe." The choice of believed is either an imprecision or it is a signal. If it is an imprecision, it suggests that Patel is speaking from the department's institutional position without having personally reviewed the complete evidentiary record that supports it. If it is a signal, it suggests that Patel has reviewed the record and his confidence in the suicide determination is personal assessment rather than evidentiary certainty. Neither interpretation is comfortable for the FBI's position. An imprecision by the FBI director about the most scrutinized federal custody death in American history is its own kind of problem. A signal about evidentiary uncertainty is a different and more significant problem. Kennedy noted it. The Strzok and Page settlement created a specific awkwardness for Patel that it did not create for a previous Attorney General. Patel is not merely familiar with Strzok and Page from news coverage or Inspector General reports. He was at the House Intelligence Committee during the period when their conduct was investigated. He was a principal figure in the documentation and exposure of the anti-Trump communications that the Inspector General later found constituted political bias in an active federal investigation. Patel and the Strzok-Page story are not institutionally separate. They are institutionally connected. When Kennedy asked about the settlement, the $1.2 million to Strzok and $800,000 to Page that Attorney General Garland's Justice Department agreed to pay, he was asking a question of someone who spent years documenting the conduct that the settlement was supposed to close. Kennedy walked through the documented facts, the affair, the Inspector General's findings, the specific text. No, he won't. We'll stop it. Kennedy confirmed each element. Patel confirmed them. Then Kennedy moved to the settlement. Patel said the settlement was reached in the prior administration. Kennedy asked who made the decision. Patel said the prior Department of Justice. Kennedy asked who in the prior Department of Justice. Patel said the settlement for that kind of case can only come from the Attorney General, which would be Merrick Garland. Kennedy said, so the Attorney General decided to give Strzok $1.2 million and Page $800,000 after they were fired for actively interfering in the 2016 election. Patel said his understanding was that a settlement was agreed to. That passive construction. Agreed to, not decided to, not authorized by Garland, is the institutional equivalent of moving accountability from a person to a process. Kennedy recorded it. He had asked for the decision maker. He received the process. He moved to the laptop. The Hunter Biden laptop requires a different analysis when the question is addressed to Patel rather than to the Attorney General. The Attorney General's position on the laptop decision is institutional. She was not the Attorney General when the FBI made the decision to sit on the laptop for 10 months while 51 intelligence officials signed a letter calling the New York Post story Russian disinformation. She can speak to the department's current position without personal institutional responsibility for the 2020 decision. Patel cannot speak to it that way. Kash Patel was at the center of the political fight over the Russia investigation. He was the principal author of what became known as the Nunes Memo, the House Intelligence Committee document that alleged the FBI had abused the FISA court process in its investigation of the Trump campaign. That memo and the institutional dispute around it was one of the central documents in the argument that the FBI's leadership had allowed political considerations to shape its investigative decisions. Patel's career was built substantially on that argument. He made it publicly, in official documents, in congressional proceedings, and in subsequent public commentary. When Kennedy asked who at the FBI refused to let the FBI tell the American people the truth about the Hunter Biden laptop, he was asking that question of someone who spent years making precisely that argument about precisely that institution. Patel is not merely familiar with the concept of FBI leadership making politically motivated decisions about information disclosure. He documented it professionally. He testified about it. He made it the central argument of a major congressional investigation. He is now the director of the institution he spent years criticizing for exactly this category of decision. Patel said he didn't have that name in front of him. Kennedy said, "Would you look?" Patel said he would. Kennedy said, "I'd like a name, not a division, a name, a person with a brain and a beating heart." That phrase, in this context, has a specific resonance that it did not have when addressed to an attorney general. Kennedy was asking the FBI director to identify an FBI employee who made a specific decision, a decision that Patel, during his prior career, had documented as the kind of decision that the FBI makes when its leadership is operating with priorities that are not fully aligned with the public interest. Now Patel is the leadership, and Kennedy was asking him to produce the name of the person in the institution he now runs who made the decision that both of them, from their respective positions, have spent years criticizing. Patel said he would look for the name. That commitment is in the record, alongside the question that produced it, alongside the context that makes the commitment more significant than it would be if it came from any other FBI director in any other period. Then Kennedy arrived at Epstein. The transition was the same one that Kennedy had used in prior hearings on related subjects. He had spent the earlier part of his questioning establishing a pattern, documented misconduct, institutional deflection, requests for specific accountability, commitments to follow up, the Strzok and Page settlement, the laptop decision. Each one a case where a specific person made a specific decision, and the documentation of that person's identity has been managed through process language that protects the decision maker from direct accountability. The Epstein death is the largest version of that pattern. The man who was the most consequential federal prisoner in the country, the man whose trial would have required him to name names under oath, to put sworn testimony on the record about the relationships and activities and participants that the federal investigation had spent years documenting. The man whose testimony would have been, by any reasonable assessment, the most significant witness testimony in the history of federal prosecutions of elite criminal networks, dead in a federal facility, under circumstances that have not been fully explained, with an official determination that sits alongside documented anomalies without accounting for them, and with the supporting documentation still being worked through 5 years later. The FBI is the institution whose investigation produced that official determination. Patel is the director of that institution. Kennedy did not allege a specific alternative. He asked 6 words, and the FBI director said, "I believe he hung himself." Here is what the documentation of the investigation requires Patel to be able to account for, and what the near future deferral does not account for: the camera malfunction. The FBI's death investigation had access to the camera records or the absence of them. The investigation either determined that the malfunction was equipment failure, in which case there is documentation of that determination, or it could not make that determination, in which case there is documentation of that limitation. Kennedy was asking Patel to speak to what the investigation found about the cameras, not what the Bureau of Prisons found, what the FBI's death investigation found. Patel said near future. The guard logs. The falsification of federal records is a federal crime. The guards admitted to it. The FBI's investigation had access to those admissions. Kennedy was asking what the investigation's conclusion was about the logs, whether they were treated as evidence of a cover-up or evidence of negligence. Patel said near future. The forensic findings. Dr. Baden's conclusion that the bone fractures were more consistent with homicidal strangulation than with suicidal hanging is part of the documented record. The FBI's investigation had access to the official medical examiner's findings and to the independent analysis. Kennedy was asking why the discrepancy between those findings had not been sufficient to warrant reopening the investigation. Patel said he believed Epstein hung himself. Near future is not an answer to those questions. It is a deferral of them. 5 years of near future. The cameras, the guards, the bone fractures, still deferred. 5 years after the death, the same answer. The survivors of Epstein's trafficking operation have been present in some of these hearings. They have been in the galleries. They have heard official after official described the investigation as thorough. The conclusions is supported. The disclosure is forthcoming. The timeline is near future. They have watched the documentation of what was done to them, and who did it, and with whose knowledge and whose facilitation. Emergent pieces never complete, never in the form that would make the full accountability picture visible. When Kennedy asks his question, did somebody kill him? He is not asking it in isolation from that larger story. He is asking it in the context of an investigation that was supposed to produce accountability for a network that produced over 1,000 documented victims. An investigation that ended with the most consequential witness dead in a federal facility before he could testify. An investigation whose official conclusions have been maintained for 5 years against the backdrop of documented anomalies that the official conclusions do not fully explain. A senator who has been asking since 2019. An FBI director saying your future. Kennedy named that pattern in 5 words, like before I die. 5 years. One FBI director after another. The same phrase, the same distance. The room registered it. Not as gallows humor, as a statement about the documented distance between the promises of forthcoming disclosure and the actual arrival of the documentation. Kennedy is 73. He has been watching that distance persist for 5 years. He asked the question not to be dramatic, but to name what the pattern produces when it extends long enough. A permanent record of promises that were made and questions that were not answered in an investigation that concluded with findings that the director himself can only say he believes. The documentation is in federal files. The investigation concluded years ago. The director believes the official determination. Kennedy wanted more than belief. He wanted the record. He is still waiting for it. And somewhere in the FBI's case files for the death investigation of Jeffrey Epstein, the documentation of what the cameras showed or didn't show, and what the log falsification meant, and what the bone fractures indicated, that documentation exists. It has not been produced. The director says near future, 5 years. 6 words from a senator, 1 word from a director, believed. Not the investigation found. Not the evidence showed. Not the forensic analysis concluded. Believed. A senator who has been asking for 5 years said 5 words that named what near future produces when it becomes a permanent condition, like before I die. The record will answer that question, or the record will be the answer.